Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to see you all here this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Sandeep Jaiswal to tell us about some of his favourite Indian state items. He has won no fewer than 20 large gold medals with different India and Indian state collections. So when he says this is some of his favourite items, it is just that, I think. You may have noticed at the beginning, it's A to F. For those of you whose favourite state might be in some other part of the alphabet, you'll be delighted to know that we're going to do a part 2 in about a year's time to cover the other states. So don't be too disappointed if what you really were here for was Gwalior. With that, I'll hand over to Sandeep, who's also an expert on the Indian state material and does expertise material. So we're in for a treat, I think.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity today. I'll give you a little background on how I got into collecting Indian states. I'll never forget, it was 1985. I had just moved from India to the US to go to college. And I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a stamp show called Westpex that takes place once a year in April. So I decided to attend that stamp show, and I ran into a lady. She must have been in her late 70s when I met her in 1985. And she asked me in a really deep voice, "Hey, kiddo, do you like Indian states?" I had never collected Indian states. I had zero interest in Indian states when I moved from India, because back then what I collected was King George VI, British Commonwealth, and Malayan states. Anyways, I took up on her offer, ended up visiting her at her house, and she showed me, pulled out the very first album. It says Alwar. I looked at it, and I was fascinated, because all these years I'd collected stamps that were very beautifully printed, recess printed, nice stamps. And all of a sudden I'm looking at stamps that are really crude and primitive. So I looked through Alwar. I went to look at the next volume, which was Bahawalpur. And she goes, that's for your next visit. Well, I was hooked, because the next 30 weeks I was there at her house every weekend. That same year, right close to Christmas, she asked, by the way, she always called me kiddo. She goes, "Kiddo, would you like to buy my collection?" I said, "I would love to, but as a starving student, I don't think I can afford it." Long story short, my uncle, who had sponsored me to go to college in the US, said, "Fine, why don't you buy it?" And he paid for it. And that's how I got into collecting Indian states in 1985. I ended up acquiring her 30-plus volume collection of Indian states, and that gave me a good, strong base. And I haven't looked back. I've collected Indian states since then. So to give you a little background on Indian states, pretty much all of India in the 19th century onwards was ruled and controlled by the British India government. The Imperial Government of India made postal conventions. So there are two different groups of Indian states, as one might call it. One is called convention states, and the other one's called feudatory states. Now, the term convention comes from the fact that 6 states joined a convention whereby they would use British India stamps overprinted with the name of their state, and in exchange, the government would supply them with stamps overprinted with the name of the state. They would follow a bunch of rules and guidelines set forth by the British India government, postal rates, rates and charges and things like that. But the biggest advantage was the fact that once they were part of the convention, residents of those 6 states no longer had to pay double postage, or would not have to pay double postage, which I will explain to you in a minute, which the rest of the Indian feudatory states had to. And what I mean by that is that if you lived, say you lived in the state of Jaipur, and you wanted to send a letter to Calcutta. Well, if you send it through the Jaipur State Mail, you would have to pay Jaipur State postage for the letter traveled from where it was being mailed from to the Imperial Exchange Post Office in Jaipur State. And then you would also have to prepay the Indian portion of the postage, which would then be to pay for the mail traveling from the Imperial Post Office in Jaipur to its destination, say in Calcutta. So thereby the residents of these feudatory states had to pay double postage for the most part, unless they had access to an imperial post office. Often British Indian government operated post offices in Indian feudatory states as well. So if you mailed a letter at one of the imperial post offices in Jaipur, then of course you would bypass having to pay the state postage. So these 6 convention states had, we basically enjoyed a lot of privileges, and one of them being that any mail franked with convention state stamp or postal stationery was valid to travel anywhere within the boundaries of the British India. And we have 6 such Indian convention states: Chamba, Faridkot, Jind, Nabha, and Patiala. Now, the feudatory states, as I mentioned earlier, their stamps and postal stationery were valid only within the boundaries of their respective states, with the exception of Travancore and Cochin, who had an understanding and agreement whereby their stamps and postal stationery were valid in each other's state. There are a total of 40 Indian feudatory states that issued postage stamps. Sadly, only 38 out of these 40 states are presently listed in Stanley Gibbons' catalog. Actually, ironically, it wasn't that long ago, maybe about 10 years ago, that or 15 years ago, there were 2 other states that weren't even listed. Dungarpur was not listed about 15 years ago, and neither was Shahpura. So those are what I might call recent additions. Sadly, Kota and Tonk are not yet listed in Stanley Gibbons, although they are listed in Scott catalog. And Rajkot is the only other state that issued postal stationery, not stamps. So the states that issued feudatory states that issued stamps and postal stationery are listed in order. And I'll leave it on the screen for a second if anybody wants to go through the listing. This being the first half of the presentation, we are going to be covering states from Bahawalpur to Faridkot. See, here's one of the first items in my display here. This is a very interesting, it's a hand-drawn essay of a proposed stamp. Just to give you a background, the Amir of Bahawalpur was an ardent philatelist. He's quite famous, actually. I've been led to believe that his collection, once upon a time, was second only to the Royal Collection, his British Commonwealth collection, that is. So, being a philatelist, he was always trying to convince the imperial government in India to allow Bahawalpur to issue its own stamps. He tried that for decades, and so he himself this is drawn by him. It was submitted to Delarue, which was his choice of printers that he used for printing his stamps, and this was sent to him, to Delarue. It's called the Alliance 1933 Alliance stamp. Here's the proof that was submitted by Delarue, and they basically suggested that it was multicolor. It was going to be very expensive to produce a multicolor stamp, so they proposed to print it in black ink on green paper. The state approved the design, but requested that the camel rider on the bottom left of the shield be removed. Here's another set of 6 stamps that were produced by De La Rue for Bahawalpur in 1933. These stamps were sent to Bahawalpur. Unfortunately, Bahawalpur did not get permission to issue its own postage stamps, so these stamps ended up being used for fiscal and revenue purposes. Only a handful of these stamps were used postally. Less than 4 of each denomination are known used on cover. These happen to be the die proofs of the complete set. Here's one of those stamps used on a cover. This is one of only 3 recorded covers franked with the 8-anna stamp. All 3 covers are used in 1947, and although a very late usage, as the state had acceded to Pakistan by then, Bahawalpur continued as a separate administrative unit in 1947. Here's the other denomination. This is now the 1 rupee stamp, also used on cover. And this is one of 4 known covers franked with the 1 rupee stamp. Again, all 4 covers are used in 1947. Now we come to what I consider the most interesting period of Bahawalpur philately. So the Amir of Bahawalpur, being an ardent philatelist, and he was quite involved in the partition of India. So when the talks started and when it was decided that India was going to gain its independence and it was going to be partitioned into India and Pakistan, the Amir finally realized it was finally his opportunity to be able to issue his own stamps. And having great working relationship with De La Rue, he ordered well in advance of 15th August 1947, the partition date. He ordered dies from De La Rue and metal dies with the intent of supplying those dies to Nasik in Delhi. Nasik was the main security printers for India. The idea was to supply the metal dies to Nasik so that Nasik would use those dies to overprint existing British India King George VI stamps for Bahawalpur. We have a letter from De La Rue saying, just as a precautionary consideration, they supplied enclosed some rubber dies along with the metal die. The dies were received by Bahawalpur well in advance of the partition, and Bahawalpur sent the dies to Nasik as was agreed. Nasik turned down with the excuse that they were unable to use the die. I suspect they were too busy printing too many things to bother with printing a few stamps for Bahawalpur state. So in the meantime, the Amir had authorized, we have all these things written down in correspondences. The Amir authorized the usage of rubber stamps to overprint all existing stock of Imperial King George VI stamps or George V or whatever Imperial stamps that were left in the state archives and treasuries at that time, at the time of independence. So, by the way, what's interesting to note is that all Indian princely states were given the option to join either the Dominion of India or the Dominion of Pakistan, or remain in, or one of the options was to remain independent. But Bahawalpur chose to remain independent, and they remained independent for 52 days and finally acceded to Pakistan. So these are proofs submitted by the Postal Department. The tick marks that you see on the right-hand side of the strip, I believe were done by the Amir himself. So basically what these proofs are is strips of 5 with the hand stamp in 5 different colors, black, green, red, purple, and violet. They ended up using 4 of those 5 colors, the violet and purple being very close to each other. But here we have on this card, it's basically the approval of the hand stamp. Each of these approval cards are unique. This is the only one known for the 1 Anna 3 pi denomination. Here we have the same sort of approval card for the 1 Anna service stamp. This is the only presentation set that I'm aware of that was affixed to an official stationery of Bahawalpur state. I suspect this was given to some high official. When I say a total of 2 presentation folders, these are the 2 folders that I'm talking about that I have recorded. So among the hand stamp issue, there are a couple of flaws that are, well, they're quite famous when it comes to Indian philately using the base Indian King George VI stamps, and they're called the missing pearl variety. So, and then there's also the small pearl variety. Here we have a block of 6, most certainly unique. It's the largest known multiple of a 2 rupee with the hand stamp, and it has all 3 eras, all 3 of the pearl varieties in this block. Now, just to give you a little bit more background on these hand stamps, unlike the machine overprinted stamps, which the rupee values, the 2 rupee, 5 rupee, and 10 rupee, they were overprinted in an exact quantity of 60 each. These hand stamp issues were basically a result of rounding up whatever stock lay in the treasuries and archives and hand stamping them. So in many cases, only 2 or 3 copies exist of some of these overprints in particular colors. So in my research, I found out that these are far much rarer in as far as the total number of quantities that exist compared to even the machine overprinted stamps of Bahawalpur. Here we have a block of 4 of the 5 rupee with the purple hand stamp. And here we have a block of 4 of the 10 rupee with the purple hand stamp. This really is, I mean, these are all my favorite items, but this really is pretty high on that list. It's an incredible cover with a copy of the 10 rupee with the hand stamp in red on a large cover. This happens to be the only known cover with the 10 rupee with the hand stamp in red. And here we have another cover with the 10 rupee with the hand stamp in purple. And this too happens to be the only known cover with the 10 rupee hand stamped in purple. Here we have the only known example of the stamp with double overprint, one in purple and one in red. And just to clarify, just about every item you're going to see in today's presentation has been expertised either by the Royal Philatelic Society RPSL certificate or a BPA certificate. Here we have the 5 rupee block of 4 with the official service 5 rupee. Again, happens to be the only known multiple of the stamp. And here we have a 10 rupee block of 4 with the purple overprint. And here I'm boring you with Bahawalpur stuff, but here we have a 5 rupee with the black hand stamp. Again, happens to be the only known cover with the 5 rupee official with hand stamp in black. So there's only one, ironically, the Amir having so much love for philately, it amazes me that this is the only known proof item of proof status of the machine overprint, where you have a vertical strip of 10. The top 6 stamps are without any overprint. The next 3 stamps are overprint in black. but the last stamp has an overprint in red and in gold. Now, I believe there's only 8 possible copies that can exist. I own 2 of these, position 4 and 5. Now, you can tell the positions based on the minor flaws on the star and crescent overprint. And I've examined position 4, 5, 6, and 7, and they all, I have never seen a duplicate of the same position. So I'm further convinced that only, being that they were printed in 8 strips of 8, I'm convinced that only 8 possible strips can exist of this. These, again, are only pairs, but when it comes to 2 rupee, 5 rupee, and 10 rupee, these are the second largest known multiples. The only other multiple known of the 2 rupee, 5 rupee, and 10 rupee, which only a quantity of only 60 were produced, are a block of 4 that exists. Now we come to some of the errors. There are very few errors that exist. In both these strips, the middle stamp has double overprint. Again, 1 of 8 possible for both of them. This is a recent discovery I made with the machine overprint stamp with the pearl missing. I suspect this is unique because, like I said, only 60 copies were produced. So the chances of another stamp with the machine overprint with the pearl missing is almost nil. And here we have the 3-pie stamp used on cover. And here we have an interesting combination of the machine overprint and the rubber hand stamp overprint. The 4 honors having the machine overprint and the 2 honors having the hand stamp overprint. Here we have, again, another combination where the 1 rupee is machine overprinted and the 3 pies stamps are hand stamped overprint. All right, enough of Bahawalpur. Now we move on to a tiny little state of Bamra. Bamra issued stamps. When it did, the philatelic world was unaware of the fact that it had issued stamps. And shortly after, when it was found out in Europe that Bamra had issued stamps, Stanley Gibbons wrote to the postmaster. I believe they sent 10 pounds or something, some small amount, and asked them to supply them with those stamps, these first typeset issue stamps. The postmaster wrote back saying, sorry, we don't have these stamps anymore. We have now moved on to a different design. Stanley Gibbons wrote back to them again. This is again going in the 1890s, wrote back again, and this time they enclosed a much higher amount, enough to convince the state to reassemble the typeset and produce stamps for Stanley Gibbons. These are called reprints because they were produced at a few years later, I think 5 years later to be precise. But here we have the only 2 known examples of the first issue of Bamra on a cover from the postmaster of Bamra to England. Now, because it was sent from Bamra State by the postmaster, as I was explaining earlier, it needed dual postage. It needed postage for the letter to travel from Bamra State to the Imperial Post Office located in Bamra State, which was called Sambalpur. So the 2 stamps on the left paid internal postage for this letter to travel from Bamra State Post Office to Sambalpur, and the 2.5 annas imperial stamps paid for postage from Sambalpur to England. Here we have first postcard of Bamra. This is decimal number C2. with a negative seal cancel. It is believed to be unique. It's the only known commercially used postcard and was described by Gad Adams in India Post, volume 66. Here we have a Bamra postal stationery envelope, this time decimal number E4B, operated with a half anna to pay the postage from Bamra state to Calcutta. This is ex-halfback. This happens to be the earliest documented commercially used postal item from the state of Bamra. This also appeared in an article in India Post. And here we have a Bamra postal stationery envelope addressed to England. This happens to be the only known Bamra postal stationery envelope to a foreign destination. The 2.5 annas is paying the correct postage rate from Sambalpur to England. Now we move on to Barwani. But it wasn't until about, I believe, less than 10 years ago, where Stanley Gibbons had to redo the entire listing of the first issue of Barwani. Prior to the discovery of these two stamps, actually 4 stamps, it was believed that this Barwani issued stamps in 1921. After a lot of research done by some great philatelists, including Dan Walker, who's here today, it was decided that these stamps were actually issued in 1917, the early issues. And for the first time, they were recorded and listed in Stanley Gibbons about, I believe, 5-6 years ago. This happens to be the very first stamp of Barwani. And this is the only recorded example of the stamp without the characteristic. So the first stamp, SG1, has a characteristic doubling of the printing. This does not, so which makes it a variation of the very first stamp of Barwani. This is what is now the current SG1 of Barwani. It replaces the older stamp of 1921, as these were issued in 1917. This is a Quarana light blue. It's a pair of SG1. This is the only recorded cover franked with a multiple of Barwani's first stamp. By those, if anybody's wondering what that little tab with 87693 means, that's the BPA's certificate number. And here, this is the second stamp of Barwani. Well, but first set from the first set, this just happens to be the half anna stamp. And it's, again, the half anna stamp. This is the only recorded copy of Barwani's first half anna stamp and is the basis of listing in Stanley Gibbons' catalog. And here we have a registered cover, franked on reverse with the half anna dull blue block of 4, pair and single with variety. The stamps are imperforate. This is also now listed in Stanley Gibbons as SG2AB. This is one of only 2 known registered covers of the first issue of Barwani. Now we have a pair of the 1921 Quarana green on soft wool paper, but it's imperforate, SG3. This just got listed about 2-3 years ago. These 2 pairs of stamps are the only recorded copies of this stamp, imperforate, and the basis of the listing in the, so it was first listed in the 2023 Stanley Gibbons catalog. So it wasn't 3 years ago, it was just last year. This is considered arguably one of the rarest stamps of Barwani. Only 4 copies of the stamps have been recorded. This is Stanley Gibbons number 15. the one on a brown red, and the 1923 one on a brown red. And here we have the 1923 quad-on-a rose, but perf 7. This happens to be the only known multiple of the stamp, SG number 18D. Now, this is one of only 2 known covers bearing what I showed you earlier, the one on a stamp, which is the one on a brown red, 1923 one on a brown red SG15, which is considered one of the rarest stamps. Here we have 3 copies, a single and a pair on cover. Here we have a 1939 quad-on-a black imperf pair with gum from the unique sheet of 4 SG37B, a variation of SG37B, as it's not listed, as it's not currently listed, I should say, in the Stanley Gibbons catalog. Here we have the first postcard of Barwani. Incidentally, this postcard saw the highest realization among all single lots in the Covra sale. It's believed to be unique. And here we have the reply card. I'm showing you both sides of the card. And here we have a used copy of the reply card. This is also ex-Covra and believed to be unique. Now we move on to Bhopal. Here's a beautiful cover with again, a combination cover, as one would call it, because it uses both imperial stamps or postal stationery and Indian feudatory state stamp. This being the half-on-a blue postal stationery envelope affixed with the first stamp of Bhopal, SG1. It's affixed on the back. That pays for it to travel to Sihor, which had its Imperial Exchange Post Office there, for onward transmission to Kishangarh. By the way, all the first issues of Bhopal are only known with manuscript cancel. They are not known with postmarks. Here we have an interesting sheet where, if you notice, perforation is missing. The horizontal second row of horizontal perforation is missing on the second and third row, but then only half of it is missing on the fourth row. It's just very interesting. It's interesting to know how these were perforated. These were perforated using a bed of nails, and obviously a bunch of these nails must have fallen out at one point. These errors are not yet listed in Stanley Gibbons. Here we have an interesting error. These were now printed by Perkins Bacon. This is an unrecorded error where it reads THEE instead of 3. It's a variation of SG0321. And here we have the error THRFE instead of THREE. And here we have an error where the word pies, PIES, is completely omitted. This, of course, was the discovery copy. Hopefully it'll be listed someday. It puzzles me that this, for example, this stamp has been certified by the BPA. And the BPA works very, very closely with Stanley Gibbons. And this was certified about 5 years ago. And yet, to this date, it's not listed in the catalog. Here we have an interesting error where it has the word P1FS instead of PIES. And in the same block, we have another error where it reads PISE instead of PIES. So the letters are transposed. Here we have a very interesting postal stationery envelope, the first postal stationery envelope, and the only postal stationery envelope of Bhopal, with the embossing on the bottom of the flap. These were obviously printed upside down. This is one of only 2 recorded use examples. There's also a used piece known. This is X Haverback and Dan Walker. Here we have the first. Now we move on to the state of Bundi. Here we have the first stamp of. My apologies. Let me just mute my phone. Here we have the first stamp of Bundi on cover. And here we have a copy of the first stamp of an unused copy of the first stamp of Bundi. This happens to be one of only 4 recorded examples in unused condition. And here we have the same stamp used. This happens to be one of 6 known copies, used copies, the first stamp of Bundi. But this happens to be my favorite item, Bundi. This is, so the very first stamp of Bundi was also printed where you can see the word Na, the last 2 characters, are placed on the bottom as opposed to being in one straight line. For the longest time, it was believed this was a unique cover. We now know that there's 2 such covers known, and only 2 copies of this stamp, and both happen to be on cover. And this, of course, is listed as Stanley Gibbons number 1A. Here we have a beautiful 3-color franking, but the best part of this cover is the fact that the stamp on the left, the 2 annas, the first 2 letters, which spell do, meaning 2 in Hindi, are missing. It's listed in SG as 14A, and it's the only known copy of this stamp used on cover. Here we have the unique essay of the Bundi postcard. Bundi never issued its own postcard. Well, actually, I take that back. The state did issue postcards, but nothing to do with this design. Now we come to a convention state of Chamba. This is interesting to see that the second stamp has an incorrect spelling where it reads Chamaba instead of Chamba. So the letters have been transposed. Now we move on to Charkhari. There was a shortage of half-anna and 1-anna stamps, and the postmaster experimented with using a lower denomination, which is 1 pice, with a manuscript surcharge of half-anna. Right after these were, only 1 sheet was produced by him, and I think right after these were produced, it was realized that it is risky business to use a lower denomination stamp to upgrade it to surcharge it to a higher denomination. So this idea was done away with. Only 1 sheet was done, and this has been listed, recorded in the India Post. Here we have a color trial of the 1 pice stamp, the middle one being the color trial stamp. The 2 stamps on the 2 ends are the issued stamps. Here we have another color trial of the 1 pice, this time in red. Here we have a half-anna red-brown imperf on late paper. This has not been listed in any catalog to date. And here we have a strip of 3 of the 1-anna carmine. but it's on late paper. Again, that number you see on the very top, 202148, that's the RPSL certificate number. I got to remove some of these when I was scanning. So here now this is the so this is how they ended up finally surcharging the stamps, where they took a higher denomination stamp, this in this case being the 1 rupee stamp, and surcharged it with 1 anna. Here we have a postcard of Charkhari. This one is in the Quarana in rose, and it's believed to be one of only 2 known copies that was recorded by Deschel. This happens to be ex-Haverbeck. Here we have the 1 anna envelope, but if you notice, it clearly spells annas with an S at the end instead of anna. And this one being its hand stamp double, this being one of 2 known copies. Here we have a beautiful registered, obviously in not very good condition. It's got a lot of stains, but it's a beautiful registered usage of the 1 anna envelope. Now we move on to Cochin. This is the 2 puttan stamp, but it's imperfect on. So these stamps were issued on 2 different papers, thin and thick. This happens to be on the thin paper. Imperfect examples are to date not listed and not recorded anywhere. Here we have, again, from the same set on thin paper. This is now the 1 puttan stamp, and it's printed on both sides. Again, previously unrecorded. Here we have the same stamp, again on thin paper, clearly printed double, also previously unrecorded. Here we have the Cochin half puttan postal stationery envelope. The stamp is printed on the inverted envelope. This error on this particular envelope, when I said this particular envelope, it's basically the layout, the format of the envelope, and the embossing on the back is not recorded by Deschel and possibly unique. Here we have the only known example of Dhar's only known stamp printed on both sides. As you can see, the back side does not have the control seal, which was applied on all stamps to avoid theft. And from the post office, this was just an extra added security seal. It's the only known example, and Gibbons does list this in the catalog, but as singles, I don't know why, but it doesn't exist as a single copy. Here we have the only known vertical Tadbetch sheet of the first issue of Dhar. And here we have 2 copies, and the only 2 known copies of horizontal Tadbetches from the first issue of Dhar. Here we have a unusual stamp. This variation, this setting has not been recorded. And the reason I say that is if you look at the gap between the corner ornament and on the bottom and the ornament next to it, there's a big gap. This is not known in any of the recorded settings, and I've done an in-depth study of the settings of Dhar. Here we have a very interesting stamp. If you notice, if you look very carefully, the top right corner ornament is placed one over to the left and has been transposed by the ornament that is now in the corner, which is supposed to be one over, so they've been transposed. This happens to be the only known example of this error used on cover. on a registered cover, that is. So this is the first postal stationery envelope of Dhar. This is my discovery. It is in a size that is much larger than the normal issued envelope, which was normally issued on an envelope that measured 137 millimeters by 79. This envelope happens to measure 152 millimeters by 85 millimeters. This happens to be one of 3 known unused examples. And here we have the same one in used condition. Clearly, this is going out of Dhar state, and that's why you have the British India box postage due 1 anna on it, because it does not have the imperial half anna postage. So when it was unpaid, the penalty was twice the deficiency, so half anna times 2, hence 1 anna postage due was charged to the recipient. This happens to be one of only 2 known used examples of this particular postal stationery. Now we move on to Dungarpur. This happens to be the earliest dated frank cover from Dungarpur, with the only known example of the triangular intaglio seal cancel. This has the first stamps from the first issue of Dungarpur, the Quarana and the 1 anna. Quarana being SG1, and 1 anna, I believe, is SG4. Here we have just one of my favorites, a beautiful 3-color franking of the first issue of Dungarpur. This happens to be a registered cover, so the stamp on the left, the 4 annas, is paying the registration fee, and the 2 stamps, the 1 anna and the quarter anna, paying the 1 anna, quarter anna postal rate. Now we move on to Duttia. Here we have a complete sheet with the stamps printed tetbetch, vertical tetbetch to each other, resulting in 8 vertical tetbetch pairs. Now we have the same issue, but now we have horizontal tetbetch pairs. These 4 stamps on the left are printed upside down in relationship to the other 2 columns. We now, again, here's another complete sheet of the 1 anna stamp, this time again a complete sheet with resulting in 8 vertical tetbetch pairs. Here we have a cover, the registered cover again, bearing the extremely difficult 2 anna black on yellow SG10 on cover. So there was a shortage of the 1 anna stamps for a while, actually, and for a very short period of just around 3 months, the state authorized the usage of its its revenue 1 anna receipt stamp for postage purposes. So for a matter of 3 months only, these 1 anna receipt stamps were allowed to be used as postage stamps. This one being used in combination with Edward half anna stamp to pay the postage from Duttia. The Duttia stamp is cancelled by Duttia state postmark, which says Riyasat Duttia. Actually, both stamps have been cancelled by that, and then with the Delhi arrival postmark on the back, on the front, on the side, rather. Duttia is, interestingly, the only state I'm aware of, and I've still been, I cannot explain how and why and how the accounting, for that matter, worked. But Duttia, I know of 4 covers of Duttia where the British India imperial stamps have been used alongside with Duttia stamps to pay Duttia state postage. Mind you, this half anna George V stamp is not paying any sort of imperial postage. It's actually paying the state postage because this is an internal cover mailed within the state of Duttia, traveling to and from Duttia. It never went into the imperial postal system, and yet the half-anna stamp is paying the 3.5 anna rate, which is half anna postage, 3 anna registration. I'm baffled as to how they maintain the accounting for such usage of imperial stamps through the state post. But like I said, I know of 4 such covers, this being one of them. And here's the next one. Sadly in bad condition, but got a large cover again, traveling within the state of Duttia, franked with a bunch of Duttia stamps, but then also it has a couple of George V half-anna stamps and 3 copies of the Edward 3 quarter anna stamps, all adding up to pay the internal state postage. Here we have a Duttia postcard, which is decimal number C2, but it's listed as printed on late paper. This being the discovery copy, it's actually on wove paper. So quite possibly unique. And here we have a postcard. I know it's going to be hard for you to see it on screen, but it actually has a double impression, one being albino. Here we have a beautiful registered postcard. Registered postcards from any small state, Indian princely state, are extremely, extremely difficult to come across, especially from Duttia. As you can see, the quarter anna postcard pays the postcard rate, internal postcard rate. The 2 anna plus 1 anna making it a 3 anna. 3 annas are paying the registration fee. Here we have an interesting discovery I made where this word service on top, right under the words India postage, is printed, but it's albino. It's a discovery copy that I sent in to the Royal. And that concludes my presentation for today. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And if you have any questions, I will certainly try to answer them.
That's been absolutely fabulous. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else is doing it. I've tried to follow it in my part 1 as well. And there's really some quite remarkable material you've had in there. I see Duttia actually broke the world record for an Indian state item a couple of years ago. So we really have had quite a treat this afternoon. Thank you too for the plug for the expertisation service. I think with a lot of this material, it is a good idea. And as you've drawn to everybody's attention, other expertisation services are available. But it's really been remarkable. And I think we'll all look forward to a second part when we've got our breath back. Mark, I don't know if do you want to deal with questions at this stage? If we have any?
Yes, we've had a question. I will just remind myself what it was. It comes to you, Sandeep, from Apratim Bhattacharya, and he asks, if I can just find this question again, let me just find it. Here it is. He was looking at the 3 annas Bahawalpur cover, and it seemed that the address label was pasted later. Were these envelopes pre-cancelled?
No, these envelopes are not pre-cancelled. I don't know of any such pre-cancel. Let me just try to go back to that slide. I think I know which one he is. He's talking about the cover with the 3 pies, the quarter anna stamp. The answer is no. They were not pre-cancelled and then mailed later.
Okay, thank you. Simon, that was the only question that I've seen, I think. Let me just check. Yes, nobody else posted any questions in the chat. Dan, would you like to say something then, please?
Yes. The second to last slide, the Duttia cover with many stamps that was not in good condition. It looked like the British India stamps were purposely not canceled. There was a little cancel on one of them, but what do you make of that?
I think, you know, this is purely speculation at this point on my part. I think if it was only one cover I had seen where, you know, there was a freak usage of an Imperial India stamp along with Duttia state, I would say, okay, maybe this is just a freak usage. But having seen 4 such covers, I believe this is strictly purely guesswork on my part at this point. I suspect that the clerk that canceled these stamps, he or she made it a point to make sure that they obliterated all the Duttia stamps. And perhaps in that process, the one Edwardian stamp got canceled. And because if you think about it, the rule was that the imperial state was only to cancel its own stamps. And they were supposed to leave the imperial stamps to be canceled by the imperial post office upon receipt at the exchange imperial post office. So I suspect that the clerk was following the strict guidelines and thereby tried to avoid canceling the imperial stamps. But for the simple fact that this cover first of all, it's purely commercial. It's not philatelic in nature, as you can see. So, and the fact that not 1 but 5 British India stamps were used tells me that these stamps were not just put up there as a waste of money. If it even appeared to be slightly philatelic, I could think that maybe somebody was trying to create a fancy looking item. But this is a purely commercial mail. Having 5 stamps, nobody in those days would want to waste such money for no reason. So I am convinced that these stamps paid for the postage.
Thank you. Sounds logical. Yeah.
Okay. Well, do we want to do the certificate, Mark, and then we can perhaps move to some more informal chat?
Yeah, I just wonder whether Actim had a question at this point.
Oh, right, sorry.
Actim?
Yeah, regarding one of the states, you showed the overprint pies missing, if I recall. PIES missing? Yes.
Bhopal, yes.
Bhopal, yes. And you have the Bhopal, and then you have the pies. Is these overprints made in one operation or is in double operation? Why is the value missing and then the state is there?
Okay, all right.
I wondered on that.
No, I'll tell you my take on that. So these were all typeset. These overprints, these surcharges were all typeset. And as you must know, when it comes to typeset form, things can fall out because at the end of the day, each letter is screwed in tightly in a form. And if the form gets loose or something happens, in this case, what I believe happened was, and why we have all these transposed errors where it says PIESE instead of PIES, because I think as they were overprinting, say the letter S fell off from the form, and the person overprinting it put it back, not realizing. And remember, these guys were not well versed in English. English was not their first language for the most part. So I think once the object, one of the letters fell out, they just put it back together, thinking they put it in the right place, not realizing they had completely messed up the spelling. So I think the same thing happened where the word pies is completely missing and the word 3 is there, but the pies is missing. I think those 4 characters just fell off, and they continue to overprint. Normally, as you know, with typeset, when you use typeset to print, it leaves some sort of an indentation on the paper. This, of course, this item has a certificate. I think it's either BPA or Royal, I forget now. I think it's the BPA. This has a BPA certificate. And so obviously they've analyzed it quite carefully. I was convinced that it's missing completely missing the letter spice. So I think that's my explanation as to why it happened and how it happened.
So this is the only copy in this case?
Yes, this is the only known copy. It's like I said, it's a discovery copy. It's not yet listed in the catalog, but I hope that someday it will be listed.
Okay.
In a lot of these cases, especially Bhopal errors, a lot of these errors have been listed over time. I have submitted many items that I've submitted enough items that have gotten listed, and some of these haven't been listed yet. And I sometimes I don't understand quite the process that Stanley Gibbons uses to list items. I would have thought that once they certify something, the BPA, Philipkins, I hate to use names, but Philipkins is on the expert committee for the BPA. He's also the director of Stanley Gibbons. So I think he is quite aware when something gets when an Indian state items get certified by the BPA, he's well aware of it at that point. And his signature is on the certificate. So why it doesn't make it to the catalog is a puzzling question. Me.
Right. Akim, thank you very much for your question, and the rest of you as well. Thank you. I think we'll draw a close to the questions at this particular point. Simon, you were mentioning, did you want to see these? You wanted to present the certificate of appreciation, is that correct?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's been a wonderful display, as I said earlier. We do, I think, have a certificate somewhere on Mark's screen, at any rate, in a electronic format we're going to share. Splendid.
And, thank you very much.
Thank you. And are you likely to be in Chicago next week?
Oh, yes, I will be there.
Right. Well, in which case I could actually bring it and present it to you physically in Chicago.
Oh, wonderful.
Would be a novelty.
Oh, it would be nice to see you there.
That'd be very nice.
Yeah. So I'll pick it up at the Royal on either tomorrow or Thursday and bring it with me. But anyway, it's been a wonderful show. We all thoroughly enjoyed it. So I think we'll probably now go to some less formal chat, and we can probably stop recording if we haven't already.
I will stop the recording.